Good morning, communication theory students. This week, I will be presenting two videos. This first one, we'll go through chapters 10, 11, and 12, a brief overview of what you can expect. And then the second video, you'll need to watch both, will be very important because that will present your research project, meaning your written research paper and your oral research paper, which is really important. Okay, so this first video will cover chapters 10, 11, and 12. Chapter 10 is the processes of persuasion. Those of you who are in public relations, persuasion, of course, is everything. So this is an important chapter to you. Even for public speaking, persuasive speaking, right, and debate is all about persuading people to do, to feel, to act in a particular manner. So this is, those chapters deal with that. The first theory comes, the three theories in chapter 10 are cognitive dissonance theory, elaboration likelihood model, and inoculation theory. Many of them come from social psychology. And the first one comes from Leon Festinger, right? And this is cognitive dissonance theory, which you may have studied in psychology. And this, in real basic terms, talks about when we are ambivalent about something, right? We hold a view and then something else comes in to give us what they call for this theory cognitive dissonance. Cognitive meaning the mind, dissonance meaning discord or uncomfortability. And we have to make sense, and cognitive dissonance is uncomfortable, so it's our ability to resolve that dissonance. The theory, we're motivated to reduce the dissonance, right? So an example of that would be, and your slides, the lecture slides that go along with this. I encourage you to look at the slides before you read the chapter. That will help. Talks about if, let's say, you have an attitude, domestic abuse is bad, right? And no one should put up with it. So domestic violence is bad. That's your attitude. But then let's say there's cognitive dissonance. You're in a relationship where there is abuse and you continue to stay in an abusive relationship. So you believe that it's wrong, but you're in a relationship that's abusive. That's cognitive dissonance, right? So you have to reduce that dissonance, says this theory. So you can do it in several ways. One, you can change your attitude and say, well, my partner doesn't really mean to hurt me, so it's not really abuse, and they're sorry. The cycle of abuse. Or you could change your behavior. I'm not in an abusive relationship, so there's no reason to leave. So you try to reduce the dissonance by saying, I'm really therefore not in an abusive relationship, or I leave the relationship, right? Cognitive dissonance, resolving those things that don't make sense. This theory talks about, in your lecture notes, talks about smoking, right? Smoking cigarettes is unhealthy, right? And you smoke cigarettes. So there's cognitive dissonance. Smoking is unhealthy. I don't smoke cigarettes anymore, right? So you stop. Or the research on smoking is not conclusive, so I continue to smoke. You rationalize that the research isn't conclusive, but in some way you have to resolve that tension. That's cognitive dissonance theory. The second theory in chapter 10 is elaboration likelihood model. And that one has to do with, it was also developed with social psychologists, Richard Petty and John Capiola. And it talks about the two paths to our thinking. One is the rational, the central path, the logical. The second is a peripheral path, our emotions and how they work together. And so this theory talks about the extent to which we really think through issues. So if we're going to buy a car, we should rationally think about the cost, the insurance costs, the safety rating of the car, the reliability of the car. We should do our homework, the reviews from other people, and the fuel efficiency. The peripheral path is the color of the car, how fast it goes, the sex appeal. Is it more expensive than neighbors' cars? Is it flashy? Those are more the emotional things. So there are these two paths to how we make decisions. And so the elaboration likelihood theory talks about this process. This is really an important one for public relations. And we look at, this theory looks at the sources from which we get our information. And this has been really important with COVID, with the vaccines and all of whether to take them or not to take them. And so it talks about expertise, credibility, attractiveness, science, whether something's peer-reviewed, the quality of the arguments, right? So this theory talks about where we get our information from. And some of us get our information from not very reliable sources. This is an important theory. Final theory in chapter 10 is inoculation theory. Again, it comes from social psychology in the 1960s. And it talks about the key operative is threat in this theory. Inoculation is a preventive strategy, explains how people resist persuasive medicines, right? Why they are not persuasive messages, why they're not open, let's say, to taking the vaccine. What has the threat that they've internalized that has inoculated them from taking the vaccine? What are those messages? Some of the threats with COVID that have inoculated people with the inoculation theory, it may make me seriously ill. It may cause death of a loved one. There may be long-term health effects, right? That's the threat of COVID. And so therefore I should get vaccinated. Arguments that inoculate people against getting vaccinated, it's a government conspiracy. Vaccinations are not well researched. COVID is much like the flu. The mainstream media is exaggerating. You'll see on your lecture notes both counter-arguments and arguments for and against the vaccine, with persuasion, of course. And with the inoculation theory, it talks about how people are inoculated against being persuaded in another way. Complicated theory, but important. Take a look at the examples on the lecture notes. I think you'll find those very interesting. 3 theories on persuasion. Okay, then let me go quickly, and I'm not going to go into great detail with chapters 11 and 12. You're going to need to read those carefully, but chapter 11 talks about, these are organizational theories. Sense-making theory is the first one, right? And how we make sense of organizations, how we understand organizational communication, the 3 stages of development in organizations: variation, selection, and retention. It talks about company culture, that each organization has a culture. Of every organization we work for, a history, and these all impact how we communicate or how the organization operates, right? And there are functions of organizational culture which have to do with sense-making, organizational identity. Every organization has a specific identity. The social systems, whether it's hierarchical or democratic, and collective commitment, how much commitment employees have to that organization. You'll find, I think, this chapter really, really interesting in regarding organizational development. Another theory in that chapter is stakeholder theory. And that one is how much stake or input that each person in the organization has, how much say, how democratic it is. That's stakeholder theory, another organizational theory. Now, again, you're going to take the meat and throw away the bones, huh? And what you need to make sure is that at some point you will probably take a course on organizational theory and communication and go into these theories in more depth. The final chapter, and I know I've just whisked through these, so please look at the lecture notes. Please read the chapters carefully because they're all important. The final one is chapter 12 for this week, and that is on groups and families, because families are a communication group. And so the way families communicate is really important. So the first one is symbolic convergence, comes out of the University of Minnesota in the 1960s. And it talks about, with Ernest Borman, by the way, who was one of my professors when I went to college, communication process that emerges as group members create a climate and culture for their meetings of the mind. So group members create a history, a culture, their own inside jokes. There's insiders and outsiders. There's tasks of a group. There's the emotional maintenance of a group. And there's destructive behaviors within groups. So this theory talks about group consciousness, and each group has its own consciousness, whether that's a church, whether that's a family, whether that's an employment. Group communication is another area of communications, extremely important if you get a chance to take a course in group communication, small group communication, really important. Functional theory is the second one in that, and this comes from Hirakawa. Problem-solving groups and how groups understand a problem and move to solve a problem within a group, and the functional steps by which a group or a family can take to solve problems. I think that this can be very helpful to many of us to go through the steps of problem solving. The final theory in chapter 12 is a family communications patterns theory. And we know that, that each family has their own schema, has their own perception, has their own culture, and talks about conformity orientation theories in some families, or other families have a communication pattern of conversation orientation. There are pluralistic families with high conversations and low conformity. There are protective families, low conversation, not a lot of conversation goes on, high conformity to the rules and norms of that family, and consensual families, high conversation and high conformity. Really interesting to kind of find out where your family lies in these patterns that are identified with family communications pattern theory. 3 chapters, 3 different types of theories, and 9 new theories. Read them carefully, take the quizzes, look at the lecture notes, and enjoy.